Welcome to this quick tips video, which is all about using manual exposure with auto ISO in wildlife photography. I'm going to show you how to use it with some practical examples, and I'll also show you when it might not quite work and what you can do instead. So what is the benefit of using manual exposure with auto ISO? Well, in manual mode, you have full control over both the shutter speed and the aperture. That gives you more creative control over how your photo looks. Shutter speed and aperture both control exposure by regulating the amount of light that comes into the camera. Well, there is a third thing that affects exposure, and that is the ISO. So if we set auto ISO, then the camera can respond to changing light by altering the ISO as necessary. So we can set the shutter speed and the aperture as we want them and let the ISO change to give us the correct exposure. Now yes, sometimes we might get a higher ISO than we'd like, which could lead to noise and lower quality, so this is something to bear in mind. I'm definitely not saying this is the only exposure method to use, but it is effective in a lot of situations. And one of the reasons I like it is it just gives you more control of how your photo looks from a creative point of view. And if we were to use a semi-automatic mode, such as aperture priority or shutter priority, then the camera would be automatically changing one of your other settings. For example, maybe a shutter speed that records movement in a different way, or perhaps an aperture that shows up the background in a way you don't want. So if we want to change our settings, we can do. Let's say we wanted to select a fast shutter speed such as 1/2000th for a running animal, or perhaps we wanted to close the aperture down maybe to f11 to give us more depth of field in a flock of birds. We can do this and the ISO will change in relation to those settings to give us what the camera thinks is the correct exposure. Notice I said when the camera thinks its exposure is correct, it doesn't always get things right, and it can be particularly influenced by both light and dark backgrounds. This is where you might need to make the picture darker or brighter so it looks more accurate to you, and this is where exposure compensation comes in. Really important for me to mention here, not all cameras allow you to do exposure compensation when you're using this technique of manual exposure with auto ISO, so you need to check and see if your camera will actually do it. And my Canon R6 does it absolutely fine. My Canon 1DX does do it, but it's a little bit more difficult. I have to press the Q menu and then toggle through to the exposure meter on the screen, and then I can do it from there. If you have a touch screen on your camera, try tapping the exposure meter on that, and if it lights up, then you'll probably be able to change it. I did a quick tips video specifically on exposure compensation. I'll put a link to that video in the description below this. So if you have that facility on your camera, use the exposure compensation to get a better result. It's often really useful for white subjects. Do you use this technique yourself for wildlife photography, manual exposure with auto ISO? If so, do you use it in any specific conditions? Let me know in the comments. Now, there is one situation where this might not work, and that is where you have very low light levels. So if you've chosen your settings, including a maximum ISO, sometimes your picture will come out too dark. And that is because the settings you've got in the camera, there's simply not enough light around for the camera to achieve an exposure with those settings. So in that situation, I would switch to aperture priority, and then the camera will use a slower shutter speed to let more light into the camera to give you an acceptable exposure. Now yes, there is a chance of getting blurrier pictures, but you'll definitely get a usable exposure. And if you'd like to know how to use fully manual exposure, I've got a video for that up here. Shows you how to set the exposure manually in camera so it doesn't change, and how to do that by using the exposure meter. If you found that useful, particularly if you're a beginner, please do let me know, and do consider subscribing to the channel for more in the field tutorials and vlogs. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.